Hello. Bonjour, Tansei, hello. My name is Adele Perry. I am a settler historian at the University of Manitoba. I also teach in the Women's and Gender Studies program. And it's my real honor to be the director of the Center for Human Rights Research. And I'm here to kind of welcome you all to another one of our Critical Conversations series. We come to you from Treaty 1, not very far away from the Assiniboine River and the territories of the Anishinaabe, Innu, and Métis people, governed by the promises of Treaty 1 and also the Manitoba Act. I became the director of the Center for Human Rights Research in what now seems to be early in the pandemic. It didn't feel early at the time. And one of the challenges, but also kind of joys in a way of the time that I've spent doing this work has been moving some of the work of the center into a digital universe. And one of those things that we've done is this series, the Critical Conversation series. For a long time, this series allowed the center to combine a senior level course with a public seminar series open to whoever might be interested in the topic. And we have kind of taken that and moved it into this Zoom format. And it's in this capacity that I welcome you kind of here today. For those of you that have been logging in for the past little while, you are probably already heard me kind of give this little introduction. So if you're one of those people, that you're going to get a little bit of a repeat here. And that is to talk a little bit about our particular focus in this year's seminar series. What we're really examining is how historians and public history professionals of all manner have addressed and also failed to address a wide range of historical events and processes that we could put under the broad tent of human rights violations or atrocities within the context of Canada and the territories that preceded it. So what we're really examining is how scholars, researchers, and public history folks have addressed a historical record and present that includes, amongst other things, slavery, dispossession, incarceration and internment, forced removal, racialized laws and policies, including around healthcare, purges of people from territories and workplaces, including the purging of queer people from the civil service and military. How have languages of human rights that have circulated so widely since the post-war era helped or not helped us understand and engage and teach and talk about these difficult histories? What are the limits and the possibilities of frameworks of human rights and Indigenous rights for accounting for and engaging with a range of these difficult histories in Canada? Today, we are really honored to be joined by not one, but two historians, Rhonda Hinther and James Mochoruk. Together, they are the editors of the 2000 collection of essays, Civilian Internment. I brought it here for its physical self. They're also much more than that. Hinther is a professor of history at Brandon University, where she teaches and researches women's and gender history, the history of Western Canada, and also public history. And she has a background as a public history professional as well. She is the author of a number of works, including Pierogies in Politics, Canada's Ukrainian Left, 1891 to 1991. James Mochoruk is professor of history at the University of North Dakota and an author of a number of books, including 2004's Formidable Heritage, Manitoba's North and the Cost of Development, 1870 to 1930. Together, Hinther and Mochoruk are working with Jim Naylor on an edited collection on the Winnipeg General Strike that will be coming out kind of soon. Maybe they can tell us a little bit more about that. Today, they are going to be speaking to us on their ongoing research on civilian internment, and this is what the students in the class are also working on this week. And this is research that speaks very directly to the concerns kind of at the heart of the series, and we are really grateful to them for joining us. And so with that, I will turn things over to Drs. Hinther and Mochoruk.
All right, I'm going to share my screen, which we had all set up, and then I moved something around and messed it up. So there we go. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I live on Treaty 1 territory, and I also work there, and also on Treaty 2 territory, which is where Brandon University is located. Treaty 1 territory is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojai Cree, Dakota and Dene peoples, and also the homeland of the Métis Nation. Treaty 2 includes the traditional spaces of these communities as well, along with those of the Assiniboine peoples. And I'm very honored to be working and living in those spaces. Today, Jim and I are here to talk about civilian internment in Canada and some of the ways it has been engaged in wartime and times of perceived war to contain and discipline persons and communities deemed threats to the liberal capitalist social and economic order. We'll be doing so by speaking about our recent book, Civilian Internment in Canada, Histories and Legacies. And as part of that, we're also going to be discussing how the book came about and what we've hoped it can accomplish. We're really grateful for the opportunity to speak with you today about this important project and the many, many, many folks who helped to make it happen.
And I'm Jim Mochoruk, and I'm presenting today from the University of North Dakota. I'm actually here in my office. You can't see any books behind me, but that's where I am. And UND rests on the ancestral lands of the Pembina and Red Lake bands of Ojibwe and the Dakota peoples, presently existing as composite parts of the Red Lake, Turtle Mountain, White Earth bands, and the Dakota tribes of Minnesota and North Dakota. I would just add that because I'm here in the States, there is no acknowledgement in my university's land acknowledgement statement of this being a Métis homeland, although I would argue that it is. Not the first time I've been at odds with my university. In any event, civilian internment, what is it? It is both simple and it's complicated. Rhonda and I and the contributors to this volume are very clear that we think there is a far too rich and quite shameful record of violating civil rights and liberties through the employment of civilian internment in Canada. It's a complicated and it really is a messy and confusing story at times because it encompasses such a broad period. We're looking at everything from the Great War until yesterday. We see this as something that is more than just the dictionary definition of internment. I will point out that Rhonda and I made certain that we had that dictionary definition in our introduction, despite the fact that our one negative review written by someone who stood in favor or justified the internment of Japanese Canadians said we didn't do that, but we did. But we're taking a much broader approach, going beyond that dictionary definition of someone being interned, put into prison for political or national security reasons. We see this as encompassing arrest, displacement, and confinement. As I say, one that covers a broad spectrum of time, but tragically, one that in the Canadian context has really focused upon racialized and particular ethno-cultural community. It's interesting, I think that both Ron and I were quite clear on this, that civilian internment in Canada, and by the by, although I'm in the United States, I am Canadian. So whenever I use the term we, I'm talking about Canadians. And we really here in Canada have not talked about internment enough, particularly not in comparative ways. The most famous case of internment in Canada is, of course, the thousands of Japanese who were evacuated from the West Coast. But we also had thousands of Ukrainian speakers and other assorted Eastern Europeans, Germans and Italians being classified as enemy aliens. So I would have to say that these folks have such incredible depth of experience, and we wanted to try to cover all of that. So on that note, Rhonda.
So let's jump into some of these wars that Jim mentioned. So during the Great War, which of course ran from 1914 to 1918, over 5,900 Eastern Europeans, primarily from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, were interning camps across the country, ostensibly for reasons of national security, although part of the official rationale for their internment quickly came to include the warehousing of indigent and unemployed, quote unquote, foreigners. Approximately 80,000 more were forced to register with and report on a regular basis to local authorities. And this includes members of my own family, my baba and my grandparents as well were caught up in this need to report net. Even after the wartime emergency ended, the Canadian state managed to transfer to other forms of legislation many of the powers of the War Measures Act, which had allowed the state to imprison and deport quote unquote dangerous foreigners and others whose views the state disliked or feared. Reg Whitaker, Greg Keeley, Andrew Parnaby, Dennis Molinaro have pointed out that for most of the interwar period, so the 20s and the 30s, even when the War Measures Act was not in operation, the civil liberties of many Canadians, but especially those of Canada's quote unquote ethnic leftists, were at great risk. Draconian actions on the part of government authorities sent a really chilling message to communities. The government had found and was more than willing to use powers which allowed it to arrest, imprison, intern, and deport longtime residents of Canada, and to otherwise suspend core civil liberties during the interwar period for those who dared to think and act in ways that challenged the government, in ways that the government didn't approve of.
So, World War II. During World War II, the Canadian government enacted the Defense of Canada regulations, basically reinvigorating the War Measures Act. And federal authorities, in league with local governments, the RCMP and local police, worked very, very hard to intern a very diverse array of groups. Japanese Canadians being probably the most famous group. This included men, women, and children. 20,000 are forcibly relocated. It's referred to as evacuated in government sources from the West Coast. And they really do enjoy the rather dubious distinction of surpassing all other groups in terms of numbers who were affected, as I say, over 20,000. But a distinction that we make fairly often in the book is that really only 782 Japanese were officially interned, but over 20,000 were forcibly relocated and really had to come under RCMP and BC Security Commission supervision. So they really, we felt, were interned. There were also hundreds of persons of Italian and German descent who were incarcerated without charge, largely for their allegedly pro-fascist and pro-Nazi political orientation, and over 100 communists and pro-communists, many of whom are what we typically describe as ethnic hall socialists. These folks were also rounded up and interned in 1940, and almost all of them remained incarcerated. Now remember, the rationale had been that they were, for the most part, members of the Communist Party, and the Soviet Union had engaged in a treaty with Nazi Germany long after the Soviet Union had been attacked by Germany and become an ally of the Western forces. These folks still remained interned, and in many cases in some horrific conditions. But it's really important to note that Canada played host, if you will, to internees on behalf of Britain. And among these were members of the German Merchant Marines, some Italian nationals, and a sizable number of European Jews who, despite having been early victims of Nazism, were arrested and interned in Britain after the outbreak of World War II because they were German nationals. The irony of these folks ending up in an internment camp is remarkable. Now, the common current uniting the internment of these disparate groups was ostensibly a concern for national security and the successful prosecution of the war effort. But scholars, both in our collection and others outside, have demonstrated that in most cases, the official reasons given were not the real ones why the groups were targeted. Rather, wartime served as the perfect excuse to ramp up the racial targeting of groups like the Japanese Canadians. It is no exaggeration to say that ever since the earliest community members of the Japanese Canadian community arrived, that their lives had been unequally regulated and circumscribed by formal and informal racist maneuvering on the part of white government officials, tragically, union members, citizens groups, and others. Likewise, national security had very little to do with the targeting of the far left. Rather, federal and local authorities seized upon it as an excuse to thwart the communist and pro-communist activism that had developed in Canada, and in many cases, to help undermine the parts of the labor movement that were tied into the far left. They made use of the Defense of Canada regulations to sidestep legitimate legal processes that could have, well, at least arguably could have provided some possible semblance of justice for those who were arrested. But the authorities didn't want to take that chance. If they utilized the Defense of Canada regulations, they could actually avoid the possibility of these folks being acquitted on trumped up charges. Rhonda.
So just as the end of the Great War had not brought an end to internment in Canada, the conclusion of World War II was equally problematic in this regard. So as the hot war ended, the Cold War began. And some would argue it began right here in Canada with the Gouzenko affair. In light of his revelations of a Soviet spy ring acting in Canada, the federal government, under the authority of the War Measures Act, which had not yet expired in the fall of 1945, issued a secret order in council, so it was PC 6444, which allowed authorities to detain without charge several Canadian communists, scientists, and so-called fellow travelers. Authorities continued this surveillance of the far left during the Cold War through something called Operation Profunk, which is a shortened form of a larger name, prominent functionaries of the Communist Party. So this was an initiative that endured for some 30 years, starting in 1950, to keep an eye on and plan to detain prominent members of the Communist Party. So under Operation Profunk, in the event of a Soviet attack or the advent of war, prominent Canadian communist activists and fellow travelers would be apprehended and interned. So this is similar to what happened to many of them or their parents and grandparents during World War II. In 1970, invoking the War Measures Act in a time of peace, Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau used its provisions to arrest and detain 497 people, all of whom could be held for up to 90 days without bail at the discretion of authorities when the October crisis gripped Quebec in 1970. And as in previous episodes of detention and internment, most of those targeted for special attention at this time were not terrorists, but political critics, in this case, nationalists, Quebec nationalists, and leftist critics of the dominant order in Quebec and Canada.
Of course, one of the interesting things about internment and the War Measures Act is that some pretty important legal changes were made in the 1980s. In fact, we see the formal death of the War Measures Act. We want everyone to be very much aware that this is largely a result of the hard work of the Japanese Canadian community who fought not just for redress for their community, for those who had lost their property and huge chunks of their lives in the evacuation and internment, but the Japanese Canadians who were most involved. And you can see on this slide a picture of one of the people who contributed to our collection, Art Mickey. These folks fought for civil liberties for everyone. They actually critiqued the War Measures Act and the sort of broad federal powers that have been used improperly against their community and said that this is an injury to all. And they really, it was an amazing achievement. They sought to turn their fight for Japanese Canadian redress into a fight for civil liberties for all Canadians. And I just want to point that out because I think it's so incredibly important. And yes, it's great. The change over to Canada's emergency laws, it's a positive thing. I don't want to underplay that. But by the same token, these new emergency laws have not prevented subsequent governments from finding new ways to detain and hold persons who are perceived as threatening national security or the values of the liberal state. In the wake of September 11th, 2001, we all know the attacks on the World Trade Center in the United States. Canadian authorities became willing participants in the war on terror in many different ways, including the creation of a security certificate process that allowed authorities to hold suspected or believed potential terrorists without charge. And like other past internment episodes, this one is awfully racialized, tended to target Muslim men and men of color. And in recent weeks, I've been watching this on my television here at home in the States, we've seen another Prime Minister Trudeau invoke for the very first time the successor to the War Measures Act, the Emergencies Act to stifle an undesirable populist protest movement. I want to say publicly that I'm not a big fan of the Freedom Convoy, but I am an even less enthusiastic supporter of using quite so dramatic a tool as the Emergencies Act. And one wonders, how will subsequent Canadian governments make use of this fairly powerful Emergencies Act? Now, a point that both Rhonda and I really want to make, and we made it in the introduction to the book, was that we could be charged with just dredging up, memories from a sad past, and we should just let the past lie. Of course, that's not what historians do. But from everything that we've told you, just in this very brief set of moments and looking at the slides that we've shown you, obviously there is a rich and complicated history of civilian internment in Canada. And even the events of recent weeks in Canada show that civil liberties can be suspended very, very easily. And if we don't keep an eye on this, if we forget the past, I'm not going to say that we're bound to repeat it, but it certainly makes it much easier for governments to say, well, we're just doing the right thing. We have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We're defending all these, but we're giving with one hand and we'll take away with the other, especially if you are one of the groups that doesn't seem to fit perfectly into the ideal definition of this society. The question always is, they're doing these things for the greater good. We kind of think you always have to ask, who's greater good? Rhonda?
So the passage of Bill C-51, the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2015 by the Harper government, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's unwillingness to retract it, the use of security certificates to detain and deport non-citizens on the grounds that they may be threats to national security, and the treatment accorded to former child soldier Omar Khadr, both by our allies and then by the Canadian government, are all stark reminders of the fragility of civil liberties and civil rights, human rights in Canada, and the ways in which authorities use and abuse their power in often violent attempts to reshape undesirable bodies into questionable and politically loaded notions of ideal citizens. In this regard, Mona Okaiwa makes very interesting points relating white settler colonialism, internment, specifically Japanese Canadian internment during World War II, and residential schools for Indigenous children. She really expands the conversation in compelling fashions. As she puts it, quote, "The genocidal practices utilized against Native peoples, including forced displacement, incarceration, segregation, dispossession, destruction of community infrastructures, denigration of languages other than English or French, the role of the Christian churches in destroying traditional spiritual practices and separation of families were forerunners to exclusionary white settler immigration policies and their policing of immigrants, and the eventual formulation and administration of the internment, the capital I internment, again, referring specifically to Japanese Canadian internment. Although the processes of colonization and the internment are not identical, it is essential to see them as linked," end quote. Given this, it makes sense that civilian internment in Canada and elsewhere needs to be considered as part and parcel of a cultural and political hegemony that grants incredible authority to those in power who can and do claim to be restricting civil liberties of some Canadians for the quote unquote common good. We must be ever vigilant and active in questioning the motives and challenging the actions of those who seek to circumscribe human rights.
Although it's pretty clear that our book is about civilian internment in Canada, it is after all the title, but we're very much aware that there's a huge global aspect to all of this. And we want people to be aware that internment is a global phenomenon. We see it all around the world in times of both war and peace. Now, in the Canadian case, our wartime internment operations were clearly transnational from the very, very outset. Canada received civilian internees from Great Britain, many of whom were German anti-fascist or German Jewish refugees. We also saw German and other merchant seamen who'd been captured in ports and around the world, as well as on the high seas. Then, of course, there's also the prisoners of war who were shipped to Canada for internment, not really the classic civilian internment case. But what's clear is that we had an international brigade of people here in Canada. And many of Canada's own internees were transnational citizens of the world. If you think about it, we had folks who were, yes, Canadian or Canadian residents or Canadian citizens. They've been born in Germany, though, Italy, Japan, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and elsewhere. And these accents of birth ended up justifying their internment. So many of the Japanese Canadians were born in this country, and they ended up being evacuated and interned. Canada's internment operations clearly had rough equivalents amongst our allies, the United States, Great Britain, and other allied nations, to say nothing of the more extreme examples that one would see amongst Canada's wartime enemies and its sometimes ally, the Soviet Union. In some ways, Canadian internment operations were directly linked and followed the example of other nations. Because of Canada's ties, our imperial ties to Great Britain, and Canada's willingness to serve as a dumping ground for some of Great Britain's internees, the link to British internment operations was especially close. Beyond this, there is no escaping the similarities, but also some of the differences in the treatment of Japanese Canadians and Japanese Americans and Japanese Australians during World War II. In all three cases, though, the handling of Japanese, Canadian, American, Australian, these operations were clearly linked by a shared sense of war-induced hysteria in these three countries and deep-rooted anti-Asian sentiment. Nor was Canada's use of emergency powers to arrest and intern in times of peace without international parallel. As you can see on this slide that we have up here for you, Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau's use of the War Measures Act to arrest, detain, and intern suspected threats to the state during the October crisis certainly stands out in Canadian historical memory. There's no question it's a huge factor, but it was not unprecedented amongst the Western democracies, as evidenced by the British government's use of emergency powers during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And of course, as Rhonda pointed out, at the height of the Cold War, several Western nations had the equivalent of Canada's Operation Profunk. All the Western democracies had a list of the communist activists who were going to be rounded up and interned in case of war with the Soviet Union. Again, this situation that we're describing, this issue of internment, is not simply a relic of the past. Internment is a card that politicians can play for a variety of purposes and ends. One can see the same sentiments and the same appeals to security in the cavalier manner in which a US presidential candidate, and sad to say eventual president, while on the campaign trail suggested that we just intern all Muslims in the United States as a way of preventing more terrorist attacks. We also have seen the very recent application of the Emergencies Act in Canada that should remind all of us of the importance of internment awareness and the potential risk to civil liberties. Rhonda.
So what is internment then? The history of civilian internment is a complex one, encompassing as it does arrest, displacement, confinement, and surveillance. Indeed, the phrase itself is complex. Most often it's used to indicate only those individuals who were placed in jails or specially designated internment camps. However, our collection has really tried to take a much broader approach. For example, as Jim mentioned earlier, only a small fraction of Japanese Canadians, of the Japanese Canadian community was formally interned. So 782 roughly out of over 20,000 who were quote unquote evacuated. But one could argue that the entire West Coast Japanese Canadian population experienced a form of internment. So their real and chattel property was seized, and all were forcefully evacuated, quote unquote, from their homes and communities. Those who were not formally interned were relocated, to remote towns in the interior of BC, to work camps throughout mainland Canada, to sugar beet farms on the prairies, and to a host of other such locations where they remained under RCMP and British Columbia Security Commission supervision, had virtually no freedom of movement, and had no real guarantee of their basic civil rights. So this clearly constitutes a kind of internment by other means. Jim?
Sure. I think we could say pretty much the same thing about certain left-wing activists as well. In this case, women. Rhonda's work in particular was really dramatic on this. I would urge everyone to read her particular chapter, because the women were imprisoned on charges under the Defense of Canada Act that were much like the particulars used to justify the internment of their male colleagues, but didn't quite count in the same way. The term internment can also be used to describe some of the remote alternative service camps that were housed and employed conscientious objectors during World War II. Clearly, the more formal meaning of civilian internment certainly applies to the German Jewish refugees and other German anti-fascists who had the misfortune of being rounded up in their new home of Great Britain and then shipped to Canada for formal internment. The same can be said of the seamen and of the German merchant marine who were captured and then sent to Canada. But how does one define the experience of those who were arrested and detained, and in some cases deported, largely on account of their political views? Were they interned? Well, in the immediate aftermath of the Great War, World War I, when the War Measures Act was still operational and internment camps were still open, the answer is a simple yes. They were civilian internees. But in the years between 1920 and 1939, a time when the emergency powers of the War Measures Act were transferred over to the Criminal Code of Canada and the Immigration Act, the answer is a little bit less certain. What happened to left-wing ethnics and a few other radicals during the interwar period certainly looks like internment, but it was really only, when I say that with air quotes, it was only a suspension, a removal of rights and liberties for those who subscribed to ideologies that the state had decided were illegal. It's of some note that one of the very few bodies that actually sought to offer legal support for the left-wing activists who ran afoul of the Canadian state's notions of political propriety during this period, the Canadian Labour Defence League, was itself declared to be an illegal organization under the terms of the Defence of Canada regulations in 1940. There's a fine tradition of supporting civil liberties, right? The crucial point, of course, is this, that internment and the removal or severe limitation of civil rights and liberties are interrelated phenomena that have to be considered in tandem. And that's precisely what several of the essays in this collection that we've been talking about today really seeks to do. But it's also the case that our contributors are interested in a whole host of other internment-related factors. So
how did this book come about? How did this book come about, Jim?
Well, okay. Notice how seamlessly we get past our previous technical glitch. Well, the book came about in, I think, a really fascinating way. There was an international workshop held at the Ukrainian Labor Temple in Winnipeg. So as you can see from the poster here, June 17th, 18th, 19th of 2015. It was a remarkable gathering. I would also point out, though, because I'm doing this slide, Rhonda deserves another bit of credit for this, because she also organized a special session at the CHA, bringing people together who already had an academic interest, and then setting out the word that we're going to try to do something the following year. So Rhonda deserves a special credit.
What about that? I forgot about that. Maybe I blocked it out. I don't know.
I don't know how you could. We had so much fun. But
the workshop organizing.
But the workshop itself was, I'll be technical here, it was a blast. The purpose of it was to gather together community members, scholars, activists, public history professionals, students, educators, artists, performers, anyone with an interest in or experience of internment. Most notably, we had former internees, we had descendants of internees. We're very interested in some of the intergenerational aspects of this. And we also had redress activists, some of whom, of course, had themselves been victims of internment or at least displacement. And we wanted to get them engaged in a dialogue on the history and continued impact of civilian internment in Canada, right from as far back as we could, from 1914, if their family ties allowed, right up to the present. And by bringing together this particular and broad array of international participants, the resulting conversation was, well, we wanted it to be this. By design, it was explicitly cross-cultural, or perhaps more accurately, it was cross-internment. One of the most notable features of the workshop, especially the sessions devoted to survivor and legacy, the children and memories, was how often similarities and some notable differences in the camp experience or family experience of loss and betrayal associated with internment cut across ethnic and time spans. So many participants would be listening to something on, say, the Ukrainians who'd been interned, and someone from the Japanese Canadian community would say, well, that was exactly what happened to us. There were just so many instances that the similarities came across, and people didn't know that other groups had been treated in this same way. And so it was for this reason, to facilitate explicit comparative dialogue. In the book, Rhonda and I resisted grouping the articles or the chapters together by internment episode or by ethnic community, but rather we attempted to take a more thematic and comparative approach in the entire way that we organized the volume. Rhonda.
So the workshop was organized by a lot of people. The Canadian Society for Ukrainian Labor Research, in collaboration with other community organizations, including the Manitoba Japanese Canadian Cultural Center, who were a huge booster of this endeavor. Staff from the Canadian Museum for Human Rights were heavily involved. We received generous financial and in-kind support from a number of other organizations, Brandon University, the Manitoba Japanese Canadian Cultural Center, the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, the Association of United Ukrainian Canadians, the Ivan Franko Museum, the Joseph Zukin Memorial Foundation, the Endowment Council of the Canada First World War Internment Recognition Fund, the University of North Dakota, the Manitoba Government Ethnocultural Support Program, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, Brandon University Student Union, Past Perfect Productions, the Canadian Museum of History in Ottawa, the Carleton University Public History Program, and also University of Manitoba Press. So we were very fortunate that there were so many boosters of this workshop that eventually led to this book. And as editors of this collection, we really appreciate the commitment and patience that each of our authors demonstrated throughout the editorial and publication processes. So most of the papers in the book came directly out of the workshop. We did have to solicit some additional papers, and we lost some papers because they were slated for publication elsewhere. But so many people really gave generously of themselves and of their patience to help make this collection possible. Others helped move the book along in other ways as well. We had Connie Humes, who was our assistant, our conference assistant, and also manuscript assistant, who was a tremendous help in getting things rolling, especially in the early period. Lily Stearns and the late Brett Stearns from the Canadian Society for Ukrainian Labor Research, who were absolutely key organizers of the internment workshop. And they remain passionate supporters of the book project, which anyone who's done a book project like this knows that those boosters along the way who are cheering you on are just fundamental in helping to sustain what can be a very, very challenging and long process. Not enough good can be said about all the folks at University of Manitoba Press, including David Carr, recently retired, Jill McConkey, who tough editorial stance helped considerably improve the manuscript. She is just a powerhouse, and we were lucky to work with her. David Larson, Glenn Bergen, Gretchen Alberg, who is the most amazing copy editor, and Ariel Gordon, who I believe is no longer with U of M Press, but who, when she was there, organized and facilitated a fantastic book launch for us back in the fall of 2020. And Mike Carroll needs to be mentioned for the fabulous cover design. So it's a lot of people that helped to birth a project like this. And we're happy that we were able to do this because the workshop's conversations were both necessary and timely back in 2015 for a number of reasons. We knew all too well that many of the former internees and other eyewitnesses were passing from the scene, and that it was really imperative to try to help capture and preserve their stories before it was too late. Some of the most compelling of these testimonies was from one of the workshop's most remarkable roundtable discussions, and it focused on the memories of internment survivors and also of the offspring of internees. So folks who weren't necessarily interned themselves, but had a parent or grandparent or someone in their close family who was interned and who either recalled the experience or recalled the fallout of that experience in their family or community. And that panel in particular offers such compelling insight on the long-lasting and intensely personal multi-generational impacts of internment. So we really urge everyone who reads the book to also take a look at that transcript from what we call panel 3 from the workshop, and it features those survivor stories. And we were very fortunate to have Dr. Jody Giesbrecht from the Canadian Museum for Human Rights write a really insightful introduction to that panel. So all of that can be found in volume 36 of the Oral History Forum from 2016. Just as important as providing a cross-cultural venue for this storytelling, we're also keenly aware that the legacy of internment, with its sad record of violating the civil liberties and rights of Canadians and non-Canadians as well, was a matter that had been all too often swept under the proverbial carpet. And that's in spite of its continuation in a variety of forms and its direct relevance to many of the social, cultural, and political issues with which we continue to grapple today. So thank you so much for having us. And now we're happy to open the floor to questions and conversation.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for that. I think really kind of remarkable window into the topic, its connections to the present and to the book project. And a nice memory of that workshop at the Ukrainian Labor Temple